What would you do if you found an SD card containing footage of the unthinkable? A small piece of plastic, so unassuming it could fit in the palm of your hand, yet inside it lies a window into unspeakable horror. On September 30th, 2019, a homeless woman in Anchorage, Alaska, stumbled upon exactly that. What she found was not just a crime. It was a record of brutality that would shock even the most seasoned investigators. The footage was grainy, the audio faint, but the images were unmistakable. It documented the chilling murder of a woman, her final moments captured in harrowing detail. The police who reviewed it were left shaken, not just by what they saw, but by the calculated manner in which the acts were committed. This SD card, this damning evidence, was handed over to the Anchorage Police Department by the woman who discovered it. It led them to a man whose face and voice in the footage matched perfectly. His name? Brian Stephen Smith, a 48-year-old immigrant from South Africa, whose past and present would soon be unraveled under the glaring scrutiny of the law. Before we go further, a warning. The details of this case are deeply disturbing, involving graphic violence and emotional trauma. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. What made Brian Stephen Smith commit such heinous acts? And what role did this tiny piece of evidence play in bringing his crimes to light? This is the story of a crime that stunned Alaska and exposed a calculated killer. Join us on this channel while we reveal the content of the SD card. It was an ordinary day on September 30th, 2019, when Valerie Kassler, a homeless woman in Anchorage, Alaska, stumbled across something that would change everything. In a city bustling with everyday life, Valerie, like many others, navigated the streets looking for anything of value. What she found was an SD card, a small, unremarkable item often associated with forgotten vacation photos or family memories. But this was no ordinary find. The card contained images and videos that defied comprehension. Valerie could have discarded it, unaware of the significance it held. But something compelled her to take a closer look. What she saw on the device left her horrified. The footage, crude and unpolished, documented acts of sheer brutality. A woman, later identified as Kathleen Jo Henry, appeared on the screen. She was beaten, choked, and ultimately killed, all while a male voice, calm and deliberate, narrated the ordeal. The voice had a distinct South African accent, and the person behind it seemed disturbingly composed, almost as if he were creating a macabre diary of his actions. Knowing she had uncovered evidence of a heinous crime, Valerie made a decision that would set the wheels of justice in motion. She walked into the Anchorage Police Department with the SD card in her hand and handed it over to authorities. With trembling hands, she described what she had seen to the officers on duty, struggling to relay the gravity of the contents. For the detectives who received the evidence, it was unlike anything they had encountered before. The footage on the SD card was explicit and unrelenting. Kathleen's face, battered beyond recognition, appeared on screen. The video showed her lying on a hotel room floor, helpless as the man behind the camera taunted her, declaring that she wouldn't leave the room alive. The grainy visuals painted a clear picture of her suffering, each frame a grim testament to her final moments. The video was time-stamped, providing an exact chronology of events. The voice was unmistakable. A thick South African accent echoed through the recordings, blending with sounds of physical violence. Investigators were stunned by the calculated and methodical nature of the recordings. This wasn't a crime committed in the heat of the moment. It was premeditated, cold, and disturbingly intentional. Detectives immediately turned their attention to identifying the man behind the voice. With the time-stamped footage and glimpses of objects in the video, a hotel room rug, a black Ford Ranger truck, and even a flash of the suspect's shoes, they began piecing together the details. The SD card contained more than just evidence of murder. It was a roadmap to the killer himself. Anchorage police quickly made the connection. The truck seen in the footage matched one registered to Brian Stephen Smith, a 48-year-old South African immigrant living in the city. His thick accent matched the one heard on the recordings. The SD card had done more than provide evidence. It had led them straight to their suspect. As the weight of the discovery sank in, the Anchorage Police Department prepared to act. They knew they were dealing with more than a crime of passion. The calculated manner of the act and the deliberate documentation suggested something far more sinister. With Valerie Castler's courage in coming forward, the investigation had its starting point. Now, it was up to the police to bring Brian Stephen Smith to justice. After Brian Stephen Smith was apprehended at the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, he was escorted into the sterile confines of an interrogation room. His demeanor was calm, perhaps too calm, as detectives prepared to confront him with the evidence that had tied him to the chilling footage on the SD card. Detective Lee Unish sat across from Smith, carefully laying out his badge and papers, while his partner, Detective Bell, stood quietly in the background. There was no need for theatrics. They knew the evidence spoke for itself. But their strategy was methodical. Start small, gain his trust, and then reveal the bombshell. Do you have any idea why we wanted to talk to you today? Detective Unish asked, his tone almost casual. Smith shrugged, leaning back in his chair. He mentioned something about his truck being broken into months ago, claiming his wallet had been stolen. It was a deflection, a weak attempt to steer the conversation away from the real issue. Detective Unish didn't take the bait. Instead, he slowly introduced the SD card, describing it as property brought to the department. Smith's expression didn't change, but his body language shifted. A slight adjustment in his posture, a subtle tightening of his hands on the armrest. The detective continued, I watched what was on that SD card, and that's why I'm here talking to you. Smith's response was vague and evasive. He claimed that he often recorded himself during camping trips, documenting harmless activities like cooking meat or shooting targets. But the detectives knew better. The contents of the SD card were far from harmless. As the interrogation progressed, the detectives began to apply pressure. They described the footage in detail, a hotel room rug, the sound of a thick South African accent narrating unspeakable acts, a black Ford Ranger parked outside. Your truck? Detective Unish said, sliding a photograph across the table. Smith stared at it, his composure starting to crack. I don't remember that, he mumbled, his voice wavering for the first time. But when Detective Bell chimed in, pointing out the shoes visible in the footage, shoes identical to the ones Smith was wearing, his denial faltered. That looks like mine, he admitted reluctantly. The detectives pressed harder, bringing out more photographs and details from the videos. We can hear your voice in the footage, Brian, Unish said firmly. You're narrating what you're doing. You're in control. This isn't something you can just forget. For a moment, Smith sat in silence, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Then, in a low voice, he said, I don't remember anything like this. If it happened, I don't know why. The interrogation took a darker turn as Smith began to weave an unusual narrative. He claimed there were two versions of himself. The good Brian, who loved his wife and lived a normal life, and the bad Brian, who did things he couldn't explain. It's like something else takes over, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The detectives weren't convinced. They pressed him further, pointing out the timestamps on the footage and the meticulous nature of the recordings. This wasn't a moment of rage, Detective Bell said. You planned this. You documented it. You knew exactly what you were doing. Smith's calm demeanor began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his responses growing more fragmented. He admitted to recognizing the hotel room, even acknowledging that the truck in the footage was his. But he continued to deny any memory of the events themselves, clinging to the narrative of a split personality. As the interrogation continued, the detectives methodically dismantled Smith's story. They pointed out inconsistencies, questioned his claims of amnesia, and highlighted the deliberate actions captured on the SD card. With every new piece of evidence presented, Smith's facade of control eroded further. By the time the session ended, the detectives had extracted enough admissions to solidify their case. Smith's attempts to deflect and obscure the truth had failed. The SD card had not only exposed his crimes, but also laid bare the tangled web of lies he had spun to avoid responsibility. In every story of tragedy, there are individuals whose lives were more than their final moments, lives filled with dreams, struggles, and hope for something better. Kathleen Jo Henry and Veronica Abouchuk, both Alaska Native women, were more than victims. They were daughters, mothers, and members of a community whose vulnerabilities made them targets, but whose stories must be told. At the heart of their tragic encounters was Brian Stephen Smith, a man whose background starkly contrasted with the lives he would forever alter. Smith was an immigrant from South Africa, arriving in the United States in 2014. Settling in Anchorage, Alaska, with his wife, Stephanie, Smith appeared to lead a relatively quiet life. By all outward accounts, he was an unremarkable individual, a man who frequented local businesses, enjoyed technology, and worked various jobs. But beneath this facade lay a darker truth. His South African accent, so distinct in recordings, would become a chilling signature that tied him to his crimes. Kathleen, 30 years old at the time of her death, was born in Bethel, Alaska, a small community steeped in the traditions of the Yupik people. Her journey through life was one marked by hardship, but also resilience. Despite grappling with personal challenges, including addiction and a turbulent past, Kathleen found moments of triumph. She earned her GED in 2012 while incarcerated at the Highland Mountain Correctional Center, a testament to her determination to reclaim her future. Her friends and family describe her as deeply introspective, with a talent for expressing herself through poetry. On social media, Kathleen often shared her thoughts and aspirations, offering glimpses of a young woman striving for stability and connection. In her final months, she sought to rebuild her life, but circumstances beyond her control would lead her into the path of danger. Kathleen's encounter with Brian Stephen Smith was one of misfortune. He lured her under the guise of companionship, leading her to a hotel room where she would endure unimaginable cruelty. Smith, using his technical savvy, documented the entire ordeal on video, a grotesque act of control and premeditation. Veronica, 52, was a grandmother, and a woman whose kindness and warmth left lasting impressions on those who knew her. She was born and raised in western Alaska, where the vast wilderness shapes the lives of its people. But like many in the region, Veronica faced the harsh realities of economic disparity and limited opportunities. Seeking a fresh start, she moved to Anchorage, where life's challenges followed her. In Anchorage, Veronica became part of a vulnerable population, homeless individuals who, despite their resilience, often fall through society's cracks. For her family, she remained a beloved figure, her memory cherished as a testament to her enduring spirit, even in the face of adversity. Veronica's life intersected with Brian Stephen Smith in 2018, under circumstances that remain unclear. In a chilling admission, Smith confessed to shooting her, describing the act with an unsettling lack of emotion. He disposed of her body in a remote area, leaving her family without answers for months. It wasn't until his arrest for Kathleen's murder that Smith's involvement in Veronica's death was uncovered, finally offering her loved ones a measure of closure. Both Kathleen and Veronica lived at the intersection of systemic inequities that disproportionately affect Alaska Native women. They faced the compounded challenges of homelessness, economic hardship, and societal neglect. In the urban environment of Anchorage, where resources are scarce and predators often go unnoticed, their vulnerabilities made them easy targets. Smith, with his outward appearance of normalcy and calculated demeanor, exploited these systemic gaps. He preyed on the marginalized, using his understanding of their precarious circumstances to manipulate and harm them. His crimes revealed a chilling capacity for detachment, as evidenced by his detailed recordings and his ability to blend back into everyday life with his wife. Kathleen Jo Henry and Veronica Abouchuk were more than victims. Their lives reflect the resilience of Alaska Native women, but also the systemic issues that left them vulnerable to violence. Their encounters with Bryan Steven Smith, a man whose seemingly ordinary exterior concealed a dark and calculated predator, ended in unimaginable tragedy. While their stories ended in loss, their memories compel us to confront the societal failures that allowed such horrors to occur. The case against Bryan Steven Smith wasn't built on conjecture or circumstantial details. It was constructed brick by brick with irrefutable evidence, much of it captured in horrifying clarity on the SD card. This small, unassuming piece of technology became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, revealing the full extent of Smith's actions and leaving no room for ambiguity. When investigators first examined the SD card, its contents left even seasoned detectives shaken. The footage recorded inside a nondescript hotel room documented Kathleen Jo Henry's final moments. The video began with her lying on the floor, bruised and disoriented. Smith's voice could be heard, calm and deliberate, as he directed and narrated the brutal assault. His South African accent, distinct and undeniable, provided investigators with a crucial lead in identifying him. The footage captured more than just violence. Timestamps on the videos matched the dates and times Smith had been documented staying at the Midtown Marriott Hotel in Anchorage. Images from the SD card also showed the interior of the hotel room, the distinct pattern of the carpeting, and even Smith's own black Ford Ranger truck parked outside. Investigators confirmed the license plate matched Smith's vehicle, cementing the link between the man and the crimes. Audio from the recordings provided further damning evidence. Smith's voice, as clear as his image, revealed a chilling detachment. He spoke to Kathleen as if narrating for an unseen audience, punctuating his actions with cruel remarks. In one particularly haunting moment, he declared, "You're not leaving this room alive." The combination of video, audio, and physical evidence created a comprehensive timeline of events that tied Smith to the crime scene with indisputable precision. As the case expanded, investigators uncovered additional connections to Veronica Abouchuk's murder in 2018. While Smith had not documented her death in the same way, his confession and subsequent discovery of her remains confirmed his role. Cell phone records and forensic evidence linked him to the area where Veronica's body was found, further solidifying his culpability. The trial that followed was marked by some of the most graphic and unsettling evidence ever presented in an Alaskan courtroom. The prosecution relied heavily on the SD card, playing portions of the footage for the jury. The room fell silent as the grainy visuals and Smith's calm, chilling voice filled the courtroom. The jurors, visibly affected, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided looking at the screen entirely, their reactions underscoring the unbearable nature of what was being shown. Smith, seated at the defense table, displayed little emotion as the footage played. His legal team attempted to cast doubt on his intent, arguing that the recordings were not premeditated, but instead the result of a man losing control. The prosecution countered this narrative by pointing to the deliberate nature of the recordings, the framing, the narration, the timestamps, all of which demonstrated planning and awareness. A critical moment in the trial came when Valerie Kassler, the woman who discovered the SD card, testified. She recounted the moment she found the device and her decision to turn it over to the police. Her testimony added a human element to the proceedings, reminding the jury of the courage it took to bring the evidence forward. Valerie described her horror upon viewing the footage and the weight of knowing what it represented. Her words left an indelible impression on everyone in the courtroom. The defense's attempts to challenge the evidence faltered under the sheer weight of its specificity. Timestamps, vehicle registration records, and Smith's distinctive voice left no room for doubt. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, sexual assault, and tampering with evidence. The trial of Bryan Steven Smith was a harrowing journey into the depths of human depravity, but it also showcased the unrelenting pursuit of justice. The evidence, meticulously collected and presented, ensured that Smith would be held accountable for his crimes. While the verdict brought closure to some, it could never undo the pain and loss suffered by the families of Kathleen Henry and Veronica Abouchuk. The SD card, once an object of unimaginable horror, became the key to ensuring that these women's voices were heard in the halls of justice. The conclusion of Bryan Steven Smith's trial marked a decisive moment in Alaska's legal history. On February 22, 2024, after weeks of painstaking deliberation and the presentation of overwhelming evidence, the jury delivered their verdict. Smith was found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, sexual assault, and tampering with evidence. The courtroom was silent as the judge pronounced the sentence: 226 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a clear message. There would be no second chances for a man who had caused so much devastation. For the families of Kathleen Henry and Veronica Abouchuk, the sentencing was a bittersweet moment. It brought an end to the legal process and ensured Smith would never harm another person again, but it could never bring back their loved ones. The pain of their loss remained, even as justice was served. The case sent shockwaves through Anchorage, resonating far beyond the courtroom walls. For the Native American community, it was a stark reminder of the systemic issues that put their women at heightened risk. Kathleen and Veronica were not isolated victims. Their stories echoed the struggles of countless others who face violence, homelessness, and neglect in a society that often fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Advocacy groups and community leaders used the trial to amplify the call for action. Public forums and discussions highlighted the broader issue of violence against Indigenous women, bringing attention to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women (MIW) movement. The case underscored the urgent need for better resources, stronger legal protections, and systemic reforms to address the root causes of such tragedies. In Anchorage, the police and local organizations pledged to improve their outreach to vulnerable populations, particularly those experiencing homelessness. Training programs were introduced to help law enforcement better understand and address the challenges faced by marginalized communities, aiming to prevent predators like Smith from exploiting systemic gaps in the future. The sentencing of Bryan Steven Smith was not just about punishment. It was about accountability and the pursuit of justice for two women who had been silenced. While their loss is immeasurable, their stories have sparked conversations and commitments to protect those who remain at risk. The case has become a catalyst for change, urging society to confront its failures and strive for a world where no one is left vulnerable to such horrors. As Bryan Steven Smith begins his life sentence, questions linger. Questions that may never be fully answered. Was this pattern of violence a result of a fractured mental state, or was it a calculated, conscious choice to exploit the most vulnerable? Were Kathleen Henry and Veronica Abouchuk his only victims, or do other lives remain unaccounted for in the shadows of his past? The SD card provided undeniable proof of two tragedies, but it also hinted at the disturbing possibility that these crimes may not have been isolated incidents. Beyond the individual acts of violence, Smith's case exposes deeper societal problems. Kathleen and Veronica were not just victims of one man's cruelty. They were casualties of systemic neglect. Their struggles with homelessness, addiction, and vulnerability reflect a society that too often fails to protect those on the margins. This case forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths and ask how we can prevent such tragedies from happening again. While we may never know the full extent of Smith's crimes, we can honor Kathleen and Veronica by ensuring their stories are not forgotten. Their lives, though cut short, carried meaning. They were individuals with hopes and dreams, aspirations and challenges. It is our responsibility to speak for them, to advocate for those who remain vulnerable, and to demand systemic change. If this story has moved you, let it be a catalyst for action. Support organizations that provide resources for the homeless, advocate for the safety of Indigenous women, and work to address the root causes of systemic inequities. Use your voice to ensure that those most at risk are seen, heard, and protected. Kathleen Henry and Veronica Abouchuk were more than victims. They were individuals with hopes and dreams. Their stories must be remembered. In their memory, let us commit to creating a world where no one's life is defined by their vulnerabilities, and where justice is not an exception but a rule. If you found value in this story, help us continue sharing these important narratives. Like, share, and subscribe for more true crime content that seeks not only to inform but to inspire action. Thank you for joining us in honoring Kathleen and Veronica and shining a light on the injustices that must never be ignored.